We're really excited today to hear from Dr. Leslie Hadfield. When we invited Dr. Hadfield to speak, she shared a number of different topics with us, and we're frankly spoiled for choice as to, what about her current work we'd like to hear about. A number of us that were on that email chain were particularly interested in this paper because it really interfaces with some important strains of anthropological scholarship that are looking to question some of our traditional modes of analysis and possibly even imperialist modes of analysis in our discipline. And I think that Dr. Hadfield's work speaks to that and some of the things that a number of our faculty and students projects that they're working on. So just to quickly introduce her, she's an associate professor here at BYU in our Department of History. She's also the Africana Studies Program Coordinator. So if you want to learn more about Africana Studies, she's your contact there. She's been here at BYU since 2010. Prior to that, she got her PhD in African History at Michigan State University, as well, and just prior to that, a master's in African History at Ohio State University. And she did her undergraduate in history with a political science minor at Utah State. She speaks, is it Xhosa? Is that close to how you say that? And Swahili, and as well as intermediate French. I think you probably do some field work in French as well, I'm guessing, or archival stuff, not as much, just for fun. She has a book manuscript in the works that's the working title, I take it, is African Nurses Working in Rural South Africa, an oral history project from 1960s, 1990s. And her first monograph was entitled Liberation and Development, Black Consciousness Community Programs in South Africa. And that's with Michigan State University Press in, I believe it was 2016. Didn't write down the date here. Her research has been supported by Fulbright, and she also in 2019 was the Mary Stovall Richards Research Professor in the Department of History. So we are just excited to have you here, Dr. Hadfield. So if you'll join me in welcoming her, and we'll turn the time over to her for her talk.
If I can unmute myself. Okay, how's my sound? Am I good? All right, so just speak up if there's a problem with that. I'm happy to be here too. As Dr. Hickman said, there's a lot that African history shares with anthropology. And so I often draw on anthropological methods and work, and I have some cited in this paper, which I'm going to share. And I'm going to go ahead and present some things. And I'm going to read a little bit, actually probably a lot, so I hope that's all right. But I also am going to share some images. So I know these days with Zoom, it's good to bring in some other parts of, some bells and whistles, I guess. So hopefully that's come through. And I will get going here. Okay, so scholars utilizing oral history have really recognized that their work would be much richer, more accurate, and more ethical if interviewees played a greater role in the production of their scholarly output. And I'm going to be using the term interviewees, but one of my questions that I'm asking people and ideas I'm playing around with is whether or not I should use the term interviewees or narrators or collaborators. So that's one thing I would love to hear from people, your input on that. And some people do refer to those they interview as collaborators or partners as a way to show that they approach those they interview as having an equal role or influence in the output that they have, the scholarly output. I'll talk more about history as a historian. Involving interviewees in the post-interview interpretation process gives interviewees a greater voice or influence, but it has its complications. And this is something that I have done in my own work, and I'm sort of grappling with in this piece that I'm hoping to also expand and maybe do some more with other historians out there. So I'm really analyzing in this the process of involving interviewees in the interpretation process. And one of the things that I found, or a few things that I found, is that by sharing interview recordings and my own written analysis with those I interviewed, along with others who were part of the population of people I was interviewing, I ended up avoiding the challenges of co-authoring, which I'll get into, but still gained further valuable information and insights, fostered mutual understanding, and showed respect to those that I was researching about. And in bringing, so I interviewed retired nurses, and in bringing the women together, it also gave them an opportunity to connect and converse with each other as they collectively made sense of their past. And it even became a cathartic experience for some. So I'm going to make some comments about that. It was, in a way, an unintended consequence. And so all of these outcomes in my more recent experience, I think, support the assertion that involving interviewees to some degree in the interpretation process has more benefits than drawbacks, and makes for more ethical practice and respectful research, particularly when it involves more privileged scholars doing research in less privileged communities or countries. I learned throughout this that involving interviewees in the interpretation process works best when the researcher has a clear and transparent method. All involved have a shared understanding about the roles of both the scholar and those being interviewed, and steps are taken to ensure effective ways of respecting the authority of interviewees. So I'll be talking more about that. Okay, so between 2011 and 2013, I conducted interviews with 67 Black female retired nurses who had worked in rural clinics and hospitals in the Ciskei region of South Africa. Sorry, I don't have a broader map of South Africa there. You can see this particular region in the Eastern Cape of the country. And I was interested in this because of the political nature of what was happening in the 1960s through the 1980s that affected the healthcare system. And these interviews formed the basis of the book that is underway, publication. And the book really takes the experiences of these nurses as a focal point for addressing significant aspects of South African history. Here's an image of what they may have dealt with. As I alluded to, I was interested in the impact of apartheid politics on healthcare in the rural Eastern Cape, the way African nurses engaged with African healing practices and beliefs in these rural areas, and the intersection of their careers and their personal lives. My book argues that the nurses helped shape notions of health and healing in rural communities as they negotiated these differences between biomedicine and so-called traditional beliefs and practices, and that their training, commitment, and acknowledgement of these beliefs helped them succeed in providing great healthcare despite a lack of equipment and personnel. At the same time, they often struggled to balance their careers with their family responsibilities. And so these really, it's interesting, very few people have looked into or studied how nurses balanced or the intersection with their family responsibilities. And I look at how their experiences demonstrate that changes in marriage expectations and gender relations come unevenly, and that the ability of a nurse to succeed in both nurturing her community and her family was really largely dependent on the family support she had. So that's the overall aspect. And while these nurses, or overall research there and the implications, while these nurses wielded remarkable influence in their communities, their individual stories and contributions really haven't had as much attention, especially how they engaged with African healing beliefs and practices, and how their careers intersected with their private lives. And so oral histories became really important to understanding and writing this history. And here you can see I have a bunch of different hospital reports, government reports, and some newspaper articles, other things. I searched in the archives for whatever I could find, and even there was a lot missing about the nurses' experiences. So the oral histories then were really crucial to this in providing those insights and personal stories. The 67 retired nurses I interviewed were a small number of those who worked in the Ciskei region. In 1991, the Ciskei Nursing Council counted 3,668 on its register. So 67 out of that, maybe not, I don't know. I tried to get a representative sample, and I felt that as I looked at a range of locations and where people had different training and career trajectories, that I was able to cover the various backgrounds of the different women working in the region during this time. Most of the women were members of the dominant ethnic group in the region, the Xhosa, and had significant ties to rural areas in the former Ciskei, either through their work or their family. But they also came from really different socioeconomic backgrounds, especially as the nursing profession was growing. It was opening up to a lot more people. And I recruited the interviewees through 3 retired nurses associations based in King Williamstown and 3 really helpful women. So you can see there, Mrs. Zochi Mlako and Mrs. Ntsiki Biko. I interviewed them first pictures from an interview with them in 2008 as I was finishing my other research. And it was related in some way to healthcare, and that's how I got to this. And I went back in 2011 and 2012 and did some preliminary interviews, and then I did most of my research in 2013, and that's when I met Mrs. Buiswe Vakalisa, who's pictured on the right there. And they really helped me. They introduced me to these different retired nurses associations, and introduced me to their colleagues, former colleagues. And I also had friends in the area. I've been doing research in that region for some time, and so I kind of did the snowballing method as well. And for those in the retired nurses associations, I provided a list of general open-ended questions ahead of time to give them time to think about the questions. And then I followed up. I recruited them from meetings, and then I conducted interviews in English and Xhosa depending on the preference of the interviewee. So I approached the interviews as a history of the woman's career as it related to her broader life history. I really wanted to let them drive the narrative and the history. And so I didn't want my questions to determine what they were going to tell me. But at the same time, I did not conduct full life histories, partly because of my focus on their careers, but also because I wanted to get a broader sample. And so to do a full life history, it takes hours and hours with one person. So I decided to kind of do this, this combination of interviewing. So I put boundaries on the histories of these women by framing my project as a history of their work as nurses. But I also worked to conduct the interviews with predominantly open-ended invitations to the women to share with me what they found most important for themselves, and to include the personal or private aspects of these women's lives. And I took a lot also from feminist historians who have argued that in order to fully understand women's history or allow women to shape the construction of history, we have to listen to how women interpret the past in the context of their own full lives, where aspects of everyday life are given considerable consideration. So in conducting and analyzing the interviews, I also paid close attention to issues relating to a woman's experience, emotion, and other meaning. And again, was informed by this feminist history work, but also the work on the importance of emotion in oral histories. As I did this, I was cognizant of the political context within which we conducted these interviews, as well as the cross-cultural, racial, linguistic, and class dynamics of the interviews. So at the time I interviewed, the women nurses in public hospitals had a reputation for treating patients rudely or neglecting patients in favor of striking for better working conditions. And the public healthcare system in that particular region was often under fire from the media for the misuse of funds and failures to deliver healthcare. So a lot of these former nurses they also felt slighted by the current government. And there's some other political things that, and in fact, the King Williamstown Retired Nurses Association was founded in part to take care of the nurses who felt forgotten by society and to offer services to the current system. So this was the context of it. In fact, there was one woman who I think thought I was an American journalist, and she declined my interview request because I think she wondered, what is this American going to do with what I'm going to say? Am I going to show up in the newspapers? So that gave the interview, this whole context gave interviewees, the ones that I gained trust with, to an urge to reaffirm the standards and respectability of the profession at the height of their career and praise the system of the past, but also it determined some of the other things that they said. As an American, a white American, and as a stranger, I was also sensitive to the fact that I asked women about the details of their intimate relationships and cultural practices previously disdained by white society. And I think being an ignorant outsider can help us sometimes gain basic information, or it may make an interviewee feel comfortable sharing information she knows the outsider would not disclose to anyone else, but it also can restrict some people from sharing private information. So with all of those things in mind, I employed a number of strategies to probe interviewees and analyze the meaning behind their expressions and the way that they remembered the past. Of course, interviewee personalities, interests, and memories influence what comes out of interviews just as much as the interviewer's position. But these strategies I employed helped me explore these different aspects of their experiences, memories, and their own interpretations of the past. So, for example, I signaled to the nurses that I saw COSA medical practices as possibly effective by asking leading questions about the merits of COSA medicine. When a woman was reluctant to speak about her own marriage relationship, I asked what she had heard about other nurses. I asked questions about emotions and motivations to offer the women different avenues of expression. And also, I think my shared female gender, my younger age, and my ability to speak the COSA language, as well as connections I had with trusted women in the community or their colleagues, helped women feel comfortable speaking with me. So as other scholars have demonstrated, of course, analyzing the way people remember the past is also telling. And so comments about how important it was to view nursing as a calling, I saw them as more directed to young nurses rather than myself. And so keeping again in mind the broader context and how they constructed their own professional identity. Complaints about inadequate salaries and pensions or the negative effects of their work on their children demonstrated that the women were willing to talk about the not so glamorous aspects of nursing as well. So overall, I felt the memories shared help us understand what was most significant to these women about their careers in the context of their full lives as they lived in the past and as shaped by the present. So by looking to their interviews as the main source for the book I subsequently wrote, I really tried to let them guide me in constructing the history. So that's kind of the one part of the core of how I came to having the materials to write the book in the first place. And then there's the other aspect of both giving back and inviting their feedback as I continued with the process. So as I conducted interviews and wrote the book, I really wanted to give something back to those I interviewed and involve them in the interpretation process. I did this for 3 reasons. First, I hoped that each woman would, and I just pulled a bunch of pictures of all the women I interviewed. I hoped that each woman I interviewed would gain something from giving of herself to my project. I hope that they would recognize the importance of adding their part to the historical record, but I also wanted them to have I wanted it to be a fulfilling and meaningful experience in a tangible way. So I decided to give each woman a copy of her interview, and I did this mostly in audio form as audio CDs I made on my computer almost immediately after the interview, and then I found a way to deliver them. I often hand delivered them or mailed them, as opposed to monetary compensation or some other material gift, which I felt could compromise the interview process. I thought giving them a copy of their interview gave them something priceless that they could remember and share with their families. The second thing I did is the second reason I gave back and included them in the interpretation process was as a way to show them respect and to share ownership of the interviews. I generated the interviews, I initiated them, I asked many questions, I did the recording, but I also viewed the interviewees as owners of the interview as much as myself. So the consent forms could have been more explicit about this, and I did change the wording partway through, but I also gave them opportunities to modify or withdraw from the interview at any time with the consent forms. But I wanted them to know that they also were owners of these interviews. Even as they gave me consent to use the interview for scholarly publications and for public or in public archives. I also sought to gain their feedback on my written analysis to give them a chance to comment on how I had used the interviews before I published for general audiences. And the analysis and writing were largely mine, but I felt that they should have the right to evaluate it and approve or disapprove of what I had written, even if I didn't follow their desires in the end. And I'll talk more about that later. And then finally, I sought feedback about the interviews and my analysis to ensure accuracy. I wanted to be sure I interpreted what they said correctly and collectively, especially if I continued to interact with them and their communities. My desire to present my findings to those I interviewed was in part inspired by Nwando Achebe's Introduction to Farmers, Traders, Warriors, and Kings, Female Power and Authority in Northern Igbo Land. In her introduction, Achebe described how she considered the women she interviewed as her collaborators and conducted the interviews according to feminist oral history methods. She also wrote about presenting her findings to two different audiences of who she calls indigenous scholars as a way to dialogue with those about whom she had researched and written. She did this to refine her work in conversation with them, but also as a practical measure. Nwando Achebe was one of my professors, but just recently, when we were discussing this, she told me, I didn't do this because it was sexy or the latest fad. She did it because she had to go back to that community and she had to be sure that the community accepted or at least respected her work because she was from that community. So inspired by this respect and work that she did, I similarly presented my findings to groups of interviewees and other residents in two villages where I had conducted interviews for my first book on Black consciousness community programs at the end of a year of research in 2008. And here's a picture of one of those villages, one of the events that we held. And at these two events, I presented a brief summary of my research and roughly edited videos I had compiled of clips from the interviews and asked the people to respond. These sessions reinforced what people had already said, but also brought out further insights that influenced my interpretations, including my recognition of emotion as important to oral history and subsequent analyses of oral histories. They also engendered respect between myself and the interviewees. So having seen the benefits of this experience, I sought to do the same with the retired nurses I had interviewed. My main effort to gain feedback and show my appreciation to those I interviewed came when I was drafting the book manuscript. I invited all who I had interviewed and the 3 local retired nurses associations to come to a meeting at the Steve Biko Center in Ginsburg, which is a central location for my research. And here I presented my book and invited their comments and questions before providing lunch. I consulted with Mzako and Vakalisa about which day and time would be best to hold the event. And employees of the Steve Biko Center called all the women I had interviewed using the contact information I had and extended an invitation to the 3 retired nurses associations to attend this event. The center also arranged for transportation for those who lived in more distant towns, 45 minutes to an hour drive away from Ginsburg. And I used research funds to pay the center for this work, the session, and the lunch, as well as the transportation. When they called, I asked Steve Biko Center employees to say something to the effect of, American historian Dr. Leslie Hadfield interviewed you some time back about your nursing career. She's been working on a book about nurses who worked in the SISGI and would like to present what she has written to you and other people she interviewed for your feedback before the book is published. You are invited to participate in this dialogue on Tuesday, November 6th, 11, yeah, you don't need to know all the details. The Steve Biko Center employees reported that many of the 67 I had interviewed 5 or more years earlier were now too old to attend, or their phone numbers didn't work. But on the day of the event, around 35 women came, including Mrs. Vakalisa, an 81-year-old who had fallen on her way to board the transportation, but was persuaded by others to still attend the meeting, and I was really grateful she did that. The meeting began as many of the Retired Nurses Association meetings do. Women enjoyed tea as they waited for everyone to arrive, and then opened the meeting with a prayer, a song, and a welcome by the president of the King Williamstown Retired Nurses Association. You can see it from the pictures, and I'm sorry, the lighting was just terrible in that room. But we met in this small conference room, and I had written the book's title and chapter titles on a board. And so after the beginning, I presented the overall purpose and arguments of the book, and then discussed the contents with those in attendance, chapter by chapter, with time for feedback and questions on each chapter. We conducted the session in English and Xhosa so everyone would feel comfortable speaking. I took notes, and I also recorded the session, audio recorded it, so that I would be accurate in capturing what they said. But we all agreed that they would not state their names on the recording so that those who wanted to remain anonymous could do so. The session lasted for about 2 hours before we had lunch. The dialogue I felt was really productive and meaningful for me and the retired nurses. I clarified questions I had and sought their feedback on where I should discuss certain issues. For example, I asked them where discussions about family planning would fit best, if their contracts changed when clinics shifted from mission hospital to SISGI and government control, if the local government had an official policy about working with so-called traditional healers, and I also asked them how I should discuss their salaries. Some questioned my framing of the book when we discussed the terms I used in the titles, and as a result, I changed the title of chapter 4 from Xhosa nurses and Xhosa patients to engaging Xhosa beliefs and practices, because one nurse pointed out that not all the nurses were Xhosa, and the book title was broad as it referenced African nurses broadly. I faced some challenges that come with conducting group discussions, as I'm sure many of you have also faced, with a few very vocal women making many comments. I tried to give everyone a chance to speak by asking for contributions for those who had not spoken yet, but I also didn't want to force participation. Some who had not previously been interviewed made their own contributions, and those I had interviewed reminded me of aspects they felt were important to include that I hadn't included in my presentation. So, for example, the nurses talked about the frustrations of apartheid racial segregation in healthcare and the pride they felt in the achievements of nurses during this time. Even though before they hadn't discussed politics very much in their interviews, this came out very much in this discussion. It also led us to discuss the complexities of history and how nurses still succeeded in improving healthcare while working for a corrupt government system. One statement by a participant became part of a title of a paper I gave called Homeland Nurses, Independent and Progressive, ? After talking about nurses' challenges in marriage, which brought out personal and sensitive information from some women, one participant remarked that it was good to discuss both the negative and the positive of nursing. And more than one later commented that our meeting felt like a debriefing session, where they could make sense of what happened to them in the past and talk about experiences they may have more often kept to themselves. So the Retired Nurses Associations and the friendships the nurses had with each other really facilitated our meeting. It gave some the organizational endorsement and encouragement to attend, but there were many who did not attend for various reasons. So I subsequently met with 3 in particular individually in their homes. Let me put them here. Health issues prevented Mrs. Gamasi Mkeku from attending the meeting, but she really wanted to participate. So she reached out to me and we arranged a meeting where I presented my book to her briefly and then showed her where I had written about her or quoted her in the manuscript. And during that meeting, she corrected something I had written which gave the wrong impression about her assessment of working in a certain hospital. It was a minor issue in comparison to the larger work, but clarifying what Mkeku had told me made the manuscript more accurate and more true to her initial interview. I also met with 2 women whose stories I wrote about more in depth when I highlighted different experiences women had in marriage, had sort of negatively reflected on their former husbands. And I had, of course, obtained their consent to use their interview, but I wanted to let them know that I was going to highlight this to make sure that they were okay with that. After considering the possibility, well, both women confirmed that I had represented their stories correctly, which was nice to know. After considering the possibility of many people reading her story, Lulu Zuma expressed that she hoped putting her story out in the public would help other women who might find themselves in a similar situation to her. And when Teresa Ntonga commented that although what I wrote was true, she thought her daughter might not like it because she really loved her father, I suggested that I include how her daughter felt about her father to represent the full story and respect her daughter's feelings. So these meetings helped us, all of us, feel secure about what was being published and gave interviewees an opportunity to decide how they felt about the meaning and impact of sharing their stories. And I also was able to share or show them respect by giving them a chance to approve of what I wrote and showing them the final product that they had contributed to. Okay, I just want to, let's see here. Okay, we'll sit on this slide for a little bit. Okay, so I'm going to talk a little bit the next few minutes about some of my reflections on involving the interviewees in this process. Attempting to share ownership and authority of interviews and collaborating on the resulting analysis is not straightforward. Scholars have explored various aspects of viewing interviewees as co-authors, negotiating interviewer-interviewee agendas, and sharing authority. They raise questions about whose focus and interpretation is privileged, who drives the interview, and who decides what the final product is when the interviewer and interviewee might disagree. For example, I really love this chapter in Women's Words, the Feminist Practice of Oral History, that's called That's Not What I Said, Interpretive Conflict in Oral Narrative Research by Catherine Borland, where she had interviewed her grandmother and then wrote up and thought her grandmother was being feminist. And her grandmother said, no, why would you say that? I don't feel that way. It's a great chapter about how to deal with those things. So some have asked what one ought to do when the interests of the community conflict with the interests of academia. Should oral history projects always stem from and align with the interests of one or the other? What if privileging one over the other raises ethical concerns about the accuracy of representation and interpretation? My own experience combined with the work of others, I think, shows the best practices are to maintain a clear and transparent method, shared understanding about the roles of both the historian and interviewees, and to ensure effective ways of respecting the authority of interviewees. So both interviewer and interviewees should be satisfied with the final product if all of this is done, even if they don't entirely agree with each other on the interpretation. In my history of cis-guy nurses, I decided to seek their input on the book before it was published, rather than naming those as I interviewed as collaborators or considering them co-authors. I did this for practical reasons. And it would be really difficult to co-author with 67 women. That just, I think, would take forever, and I don't think we'd ever come to a consensus. But also because I recognize my role in formulating the project, generating the interviews, and compiling and analyzing the written as well as the oral historical data. So although some retired nurses such as Mtlako and Biko and Vakalisa could be considered research collaborators, and I do highlight their role in this work, I don't refer to the majority of those I interviewed as collaborators. Mtlako, Biko, and Vakalisa really played a significant role in educating me about the topic and terrain of research and introducing me to people to interview. But while the interviews I conducted with all the women shaped my analysis and focus in the resulting book, the project was larger than the interviews, which I framed in the first place because it involved documentary research. The majority of the women I interviewed thus played the role of significant contributors of evidence in the research process. But in compiling and analyzing all this evidence, I played the role of the historian in distilling and representing the past with a wider view. My book synthesized historical evidence to make sense of the past and thus would not be an exact replica of their experiences. I sought to take into account a wide variety of perspectives and historical evidence they may not have had while still representing and interpreting the past. But I sought to do so in a way that reflected their reality and their own historical interpretations as accurately as possible. I wanted them to feel satisfied with the final product, to find my wider view enlightening, not misleading. Does the fact that I have the main share of authorship mean my history is inaccurate? Would the women I interviewed recognize my representation as a reflection of their lived experience? That was, after all, one of the main purposes of my research and writing, to represent their experiences. Would they agree with my interpretation? I asked myself these questions and then turned to the women for the answers. And seeking out their feedback in the interpretation process gave the women another significant contributing role, one that influenced the final interpretation. Still, as I made the final decisions about how much they influenced what I wrote, I took full responsibility for the final product. And I have to be honest about that in presenting this. This approach, considering my interviewees as significant contributors in both providing the main evidence and in evaluating and influencing my interpretation, was clear to me more so during the writing process than the interview process. And this was not necessarily a problem for my interactions, thankfully. The consent forms interviewees signed made it clear that they would obtain a copy of their interview to do with what they wished, and that I would also have ownership over the interview, which I would transcribe, deposit into an archive, make available to the public, and use in my publications. And so I presented this and was open about my plans to write a book and told them where I planned to deposit their interviews. As educated and professional women, they understood what this meant. And that, in a way, was kind of nice to work with nurses who were trained to be very careful with private information. I also did not promise anything more than I delivered. I hoped it was clear that I would be the one to make the final choices about what went into the book, even though I had asked for their advice and take their input into account. I did change the word slightly in the consent form after the first round of interviews from "you may also request and obtain a copy" to "you will obtain a copy," because I wanted to reflect that. That it wasn't explicitly stating that they could have the same user rights as myself as outlined in the preceding sentence. If I had formulated a clearer view of my approach from the beginning, I could have been more explicit with the women about the process and what they could expect in the end result. I also could have impressed upon them the value I place on their feedback, which I plan to seek in the future, and how I would balance that with my work as a historian. I think if oral historians are clear and transparent, there should be no surprises about what will happen to the interview, and both interviewees and historians should have the right expectations about authorship. So that's one thing I would have done differently. But even if this process is followed, some historians and interviewees may disagree about the final interpretation or the broader view, taking into account various perspectives that might come across as erroneous to some interviewees. So an effort to present written work to those one has interviewed could result in contention between the research and the interviewees. That process in and of itself, however, is instructive and could still lead to mutual respect, especially if mutual understanding is achieved and the views expressed are taken seriously and even presented along with the final analysis. So, for example, in Achebe's book, she wrote about how she was critiqued, even attacked, by a male professor in the Nsukka region of Nigeria and African feminists alike for her work on Nsukka women. As she described it, in the case of the professor in Nsukka, when she had the chance to demonstrate the evidence that she used to come to her conclusions, she found understanding rather than resistance. By the time her book was published, then, she had worked through these responses. And by including their views and her own answers in her introduction, she afforded the people space to make their views known and also more fully explained her methods and interpretations. In these incidents, Achebe was dialoguing with indigenous scholars rather than those she interviewed, but a similar process in honest writing can help researchers respectfully present various viewpoints that may have conflicted with their own, while still adhering to their own interpretation. And then Borland's chapter, which I already talked about, presenting her grandmother's disagreement with her interpretation of her grandmother's history, achieved a similar end. Her exchange with her grandmother about what she wrote brought them to a greater understanding, and her writing about their exchange gave her grandmother's interpretation a place aside her own. Thus, both voices gained recognition, and all learned through the exchange, Borland, her grandmother, and the readers. An added benefit for the retired nurses who attended the dialogue session, and here I'm wrapping up, was that the gathering also served as a form of group therapy and a reunion. I took statements about the meeting being a debriefing session to mean that some of the women had seen it as a chance to process their individual experiences as a group in the context of the wider view. Certainly, they talked often as retired nurses associations or friends about their careers, but judging by the interest in my chapter about marriage and child rearing, and yet their reluctance to speak when I first finished presenting about that chapter, I don't think they had talked about some of these very personal aspects much in public. But during this session, they learned how others felt and experienced similar aspects. Like group therapy then, they could learn from each other and feel connected to others with similar challenges and experiences. The session also gave these women the opportunity to see longtime colleagues and friends, especially many of them in their old age, that they did not often see since their retirement and because of those restrictions of old age. They remarked that it was like a reunion and clearly enjoyed catching up as they sat and ate lunch together. These aspects confirmed to me that bringing interviewees together as a group to discuss and evaluate their history has the potential to be cathartic in some way, and that kind of depends on who you're talking about, so we can talk more about that. So just in conclusion, so in addition to all that I did to carefully interview these retired nurses and interpret the histories they shared as accurately as possible, I sought to involve them to a degree in the interpretation process, and in my case, it worked best to solicit their feedback as a group and to seek feedback from key individuals as contributors, but not co-authors. By giving them copies of their interviews, organizing such an event, showing them what I wrote, and listening to them again, I paid respect to them and their stories. Our dialogue session also helped me adjust my interpretation to more accurately represent their views and experiences. If anything, the retired nurses who attended the session, I think, had a good experience. I hope that when these nurses read the published book, they will still have good feelings about the process and the product. When interviewees are included in some form of interpretation in a transparent and respectful way, I think that this should be the outcome and should make for more ethical oral history research. So thank you for listening to me. I hope the pictures made it more interesting, and I'm actually eager to take your questions and comments.